I'm James Barron, and I'd like to welcome everybody to our Zoom conversation with Shahzia Sikander this evening. We're really thrilled to have her. I mean, it seems as though the world has really shifted its gaze over to Shahzia, perhaps in particular after the Morgan Library show, which I must say, for me, was one of the most powerful shows that I saw that entire year. And I kept going back. I think it told the story of an artist emigrating to America. It also told the story of how America can be a great country, and it can be a country that accepts and embraces people from different backgrounds. Shahzia really needs no introduction, but she has won a MacArthur Foundation in 2006, a US Art Medal in 2012, a Fukuoka Laureate in 2022, Pollock Prize for Creativity in 2023. And we're super excited to say that on May 3rd, the Drawing Center will be honoring Shahzia. So welcome, how are you today?
Oh, thank you, James. I'm wonderful, thank you. Super excited to get this chance to speak with you.
It's kind of amazing, we never see each other, so we have to do Zooms more often.
I know.
It'll be like a Zoom friendship. I am very excited that we're including your work in our current show, which is called Mosaics. We'll get to that much later. Debbie Davis curated the show, and it was the first time I've turned the reins over to an outside curator, and it really was kind of fabulous. One little suggestion I had was Shahzia Sikander, and Debbie, of course, was like, oh my God, yes. So the work right here to my side is the work on paper that we have normally on the wall behind me. Shahzia, I was saying just before we started, I think it'd be great if we could expand what the understanding is of you as an artist and your work, rather than it being continually encapsulated, which is what I find, let's say, on museum labels. It becomes almost a caricature. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do, in terms of the introduction, right? But I think that was the beauty of the exhibit at the Morgan Library, was that it was curated by Jan Howard at the
Right.
RISD Museum. And Jan is such an incredibly, super sensitive, brilliant, wonderful collaborator. So there were lots of discussions around the work. And I think all of that fed into the quality of the wall labels, and the language used and everything in terms of talking about the work was very, very much a dialogue going on with the work, with the artist, with the time. At that time, it was so many layers were woven in. And I think so much of that is often missing. So you read a wall label and, it already feels dated.
Right. I should say that the RISD Museum is very close to my heart. I had gone to Brown. At the RISD Museum, they have this great hall, which suddenly, instead of being this Victorian salon-style showroom, they put a Cy Twombly next to a Roman bust, next to a Victorian painting, next to all these things. And it was the first time I'd ever seen that a museum could make you work for the associations. And I think it actually informed the way I see and even the way I exhibit in my own shows. Now, Shahzia, you're going to be giving us an overview of Mosaics in your own work. And then just as an overview for our viewers, the second part, we'll go through the exhibition. We'll talk about, it'll be maybe more of a dialogue, and we can have some Q&A at the end. So would you like to start with your presentation?
Yes, that would be great. So I'm going to share my screen. All right. All right. So you just making sure it's all good.
I was actually at the opening for this.
Oh, you were?
It was incredible. I was living in Rome at the time, and I came over and the dates coincided, and I was so thrilled. That was a really thrilling exhibition.
Oh yeah, that too, for me to be able to dig into their archives and look for material and create, as you said, these juxtapositions and relationships between the works, between different objects, and as well as their particular history of American collecting, and then how all of it inspired me to make my work. So yeah, but I think, that's exactly what I was starting with, is that how how we experience art and, you know, how we respond to it is, and how we interpret it is such an open-ended premise. And for me, that has always been sort of a guiding principle. Like, as an artist, what can I do to create something which is wondrous, but it also has many possible associations, and at the same time, it can create thought as well as difference. And that's like a really like a consistent theme. So that for me is more of a theme than, say, you know, being pigeonholed or often sort of early years straitjacketed in terms of my biography. So that's just one kind of a clear thing, how I see how that runs through my work. But of course, there is a sort of early background. And since you mentioned the Morgan Library exhibit, but it was sort of in the mid 1980s that when I was working in Pakistan as a young artist, looking into the manuscript painting tradition and how sort of that dialogue with into what it meant to be what it meant to be witnessing that history as a young artist, and how to create sort of how to expand on it in an international manner over the years, over the decades. So this sort of examining of the 19th, 20th century colonial archives, which often had very narrow representations around race, empire, diaspora, gender, sexuality, politics, etc. So I created this work, which is called The Scroll, which which now when I look at it, you know, there's a book that is also on the painting. So it looks at that particular work through the lens of the child. And that's sort of a story on my early years as an artist. But in the painting itself, you see this ghost-like character that's walking through the frame on the left, like this character, which is I bring it up because I find that there's such an interesting relationship with this form in my current sculpture at the Morgan Library. So that idea is so exciting, to be able to sort of examine one's own work, you know, in many different ways. So that's exactly what I meant, like how so much of it is very cyclical at the same time. But so these female iconography. Sorry.
Did you have a teacher who said, Shahzia, could you look at these and see if you can give it a contemporary interpretation? Or did you respond to them? And then did you have a teacher who said, wow, I think you should go down that avenue?
Well, I studied it at a time when it was the beginning, right? It wasn't like the way it became incredibly popular the last decade and two. So at that time, I was there was a lot of emphasis on learning the craft and to sticking to a certain style and way of thinking and working. But as I think, like, since I worked very hard, I won over the teacher too, that I could be trusted in terms of like learning, being very much mindful of the skill and the craft, but at the same time, the experimentation would be in dialogue with it. And that was over a period of a couple of years, and, you know, like literally working 14, 18 hours a day.
And were there any people who were saying this is blasphemy, what you're doing, this kind of modern contemporary interpretation of a traditional medium?
Not really. I think at that time, just in general, engaging with this medium itself was going against the grain. It's like, you know, mid 80s, abstract expressionism was everywhere. Like I'm like, you know, studying in Pakistan in an art school was not that different from an art school elsewhere. It was also, it's got a colonial history. So it was also like, it has a whole history with English schooling and kind of the Boha structure, as well as a certain kind of recognition of the industriousness of crafts and different departments, fine arts, painting, printmaking. Here, just I think miniature painting itself was very new. and the teacher Bashir Ahmed had been very instrumental in getting it as part of a degree getting major.
It's interesting that the narrative takes place in different little sectors. It reminds me almost of early Renaissance or late medieval, especially like Sienese painting, where you see something happening and they're telling a story. Is that a big part of it? Can you talk about the storytelling element in this work?
Well, the manuscript painting tradition is very vast, right? So it's like we're not talking just South Asia, it's Central Asia, it's further all the way into it's Spain and Turkey and East Asia. So it's very hard to just summarize it as one type of painting. At this time, I became interested in Safavid painting school, which I might have here. The painting on the right would be an example of me looking at the reproductions of Safavid school of painting. And I brought the painting on the left because this to me is like my first maybe a mosaic. If you look at it closely, I created the whole thing with with a collage, but a collage that was cut up and created in a mosaic-like fashion. And I thought, oh, wouldn't it be interesting to bring this out and see where it fits in today's conversation. But this is the study that I did for the manuscript work that we were just talking about. So I did not approach it in any traditional way. I did large scale collage or paintings and then sort of developed my narrative and composition. And then even in this particular work, I first laid out flat colors and then simplified areas and then covered everything with more and more sort of rendered it and added more detail. So it's a slow process. It took over a year.
And did you know at a very early age that you had a really good hand and that you could record minute detail?
It was very much in the practice of making. And yeah, like the working in this medium, looking at these drawings, and then like this painting on the right, like it still is now, your brain, your hand sort of remembers the memory of the experience over time, like it's also practice, but it took a while to acquire it. So that level of dedication and training of sorts, training of brain and hand and control was like several hours a day, every day for years.
So you were working 18 hours a day sometimes.
Sometimes, yeah.
Like
I didn't make many friends because I was always working.
I mean, I don't think you went to many peg parties,
and at this age, it's like before, like I was a teenager when I started. So and it just amazes me because, I wonder if like that was a particular moment in time before, of course, before internet, before social media. So maybe it would be hard to replicate it.
But you like that sort of isolation when you're working for long periods of time?
Yeah, I still have it. I think for me, it really becomes critical when I'm working that I feel that I have large chunks of time. It's very hard for me to have like work for a few hours and then go and meet people for dinners. I can't do that.
And your parents were supportive of this, intense devotion to your work?
I think they had no choice. They came around to it, I think, all their lives. My father passed away a year and a half ago, but I think throughout their lives, they just sort of, it was a constant thing. Like, they had to come to terms with it, but it was never like fully like accepting that, okay, this is who she is.
It's funny because this picture on the left is at the Aldrich Museum.
I
And I was
know.
at the Aldrich this morning with Diana Bose and Richard Klein, who after I believe it's 32 years is retiring. This is his last exhibition. And we have a Beverly Pepper in the show, but they both were aware already about the Drawing Center honoring you in May. And they wanted me to send their best regards to you.
Yeah, it was a wonderful exhibit, the Aldrich Museum show. I worked with, and it traveled, it was a partnership with Tang Museums. So it was Jessica Howe and Ian Berry. And I think they had just sort of, this is the beginning of the curatorial center at Bard. So it was also like they had graduated from there. And I think one of my first shows was when they were students. So it was a show, the student show, I think with Byron Kim, myself, Yinka Schonebert, a couple of other people. So it was really an interesting time. So it does feel, when you bring up the Drawing Center was, I think, my first show in New York City also.
But the two have a similarity because they really launched a lot of careers. So for those of you who aren't aware of our neck of the woods, South Kent is about 40 minutes from the Aldrich. So we can be there like that. And we've had a very close relationship between the museum and the gallery. We've given various parties, and we're actually going to do one again this summer in honor of Richard Klein, who, 32 years with one great show after the next, Anyway, back to your work. Could you talk about, oh, wow, look at this on the left. That has resonance to a sculpture that we've all seen recently.
Yeah, I think that these are early drawings, and I whenever I look at them, then I was like, okay, many of these forms that were evolving, they feel very androgynous, and they are often very sort of fragmented. They are headless torsos. They are like these self-rooted, floating half-human figures. But all of these things that feel very buoyant and afloat, but they're basically refusing to belong or to be fixed or to be stereotyped. And I think that is how one felt in terms of, the sort of certain assumptions or being placed in different categories. So how to sort of respond to that. So these forms were evolving. And perhaps as a means of resisting categorization, and also maybe the lack of, brown South Asian representation, even in the feminist spaces of the 1990s art world and art history books. So again, like this painting I pulled out because I was thinking of how I was playing with the skirt a long time ago. There is this sort of expanded trail in which she's bringing along all her baggage, all the different characters, maybe it's different alter egos, but it's sort of like a procession. And many of these forms were tied together under this guise of the skirt. So there's that obviously is connected to the sculpture. And then of course, this particular character of the form that is rooted into itself. It just carries its roots everywhere. And you see that here in the sculpture itself. And this sort of idea of rootedness or the paradox, it was obviously, kind of questioning who is a foreigner, who isn't. And then also playing with ink, like the gouache and ink was leading to the evolvement of such forms. So I wanted to keep that intact in my shift from the drawn into the sculptural. Like, how could I create a sculpture that didn't feel heavy, that felt as if it was moving upward and floating? And these are the drawings that initiated it. And that sort of is how the piece is at the bottom. It's sort of lifted off the floor. It doesn't touch the ground. But it's also,
I love that you go back and you mine your own work to get imagery, and then you expand it into different mediums. And we've seen this continually in your work, not just with this sculpture, which, by the way, I saw it for the first time the week before last on a really foggy, beautiful, atmospheric night. And I love that there were people so engaged with it, not just like taking selfies in front of it, but like really experiencing it kind of almost in the round. But can you talk a little bit about this when you're in the studio and you're coming up with this idea for sculpture? Did you have it right away that you're going to go back to some of those drawings and catch some of that imagery and try to expand it?
No, I think it was more that I needed to stick to the language which was in the work, at least for my first large scale sculpture. Like I felt like that I understand that language so well. And I was also curious to understand and see what happens when a painting is made into a sculpture. Like what are the how will it respond? How will the public respond? And all of these things are playing out in time right now, in terms of even the responses to the work and how different they are towards a similar language that is in the sculpture versus how even a recent show like the Morgan Library show, right? So that those are things that I was very curious. Plus, I also felt that often my work is restricted to a certain sort of description, that it's often related to space, to scale, because it's been in small format. And I never think of that as small. I often think of the scale as being about space. So even in the detail, there's lots of space which is compressed in. That's very heroic in nature. That hints at like worlds that are at the borders, and it's very expansive. So I was like, I have to, if I do the sculpture, I'm not doing anything different, but the reception will most likely be very different. So that's also, I think, one of the reasons why it naturally led to it.
There's a certain kind of stare that one sees, especially at art fairs, but sometimes in museums, where somebody's kind of like walking by and they're going like this, and they're just like taking things in. But when I saw your show at the Morgan, people were very close. They were taking their time and they were patient to get close to the works. Then they were spending a lot of time looking, and it was into this deep space, this kind of deep imagination. So I do think that people sensed the grandness of the space, even in a miniature.
Interesting, right? But yeah, I saw people spend a lot of time with each work, but equal amount of time reading the labels. And I love that, because often like you have to fight with institutions, like everything has to be like either dumbed down or reduced, especially I'm not sure, I'm speaking for my experience only, not for other artists, but oftentimes I've seen that, yeah, that happens where it's like reduce the amount of words, unless the artist has that sort of privilege woven in terms of people's knowledge of that work. Or so I often thought, like, the types of wall labels that I've encountered looking at my work whenever it pops up in any permanent collection, and the first thing I read is like, and I wonder like who's writing them, and why don't these institutions ever engage the artist? Like at what point will they ask the artist about the work?
So can you talk about your involvement with Morgan in terms of the wall labels?
Yeah, like the wall labels were all done in conversation with Jan Howard. So so the show was curated by RISD Museum, and I think for a long period of time, the conversations were just unfolding. I was often there. I was also teaching. I was engaging with the students. There was lots of conversations that had led to the exhibition. Initially, it was going to be, we were just going to record conversations with students and maybe publish that into a book. And then the museum heard of it and decided to attach an exhibition to it. So it was born out of all these questions, like why why is the work written about in this manner in the 90s? Like, what happened? So most of the rhetoric around my work, literally, I have like I have almost many of my older material, publications, etc. on my website. So even if you look at it, it's amazing. Some of the same paragraphs are cut and pasted over like first couple of years, then over the next few years, then it goes on.
Yeah.
It was a very frustrating thing to be stuck in. Like, why? What is it that what? And the onus was often like, oh, well, you talk about your work. So
This is something that I'm very irritated by also. And even like a minor example, we had a work by Richard Diebenkorn, which was obviously ink on paper. And somebody, maybe it was like a recent college graduate, 1965, had written gouache on paper. And it was gouache on paper for every label, including museums, for like 40 years, 50 years. And I contacted the foundation. I said, it's not gouache, it's like ink. They said, of course it's ink. I said, so one person had written something, then it was repeated and it become truth. It's the same with, museum labels and not challenging, not engaging the artist. Yeah. Tell us about this. This is really beautiful, this detail of the mosaic.
yeah, so there's this gorgeous dome in the courthouse. So when I was putting the drawings and the proposal together, I wanted to refer to the courthouse because I was proposing one of the sculptures to be on the roof of the courthouse. So I had looked at the courthouse. So I was using that dome and its armature as a influence for the skirt, and that's what you see. And then this gorgeous glass. Then I was like, oh, this might be a great way for me to bring in my practice of mosaic as a sort of allowing me to bring glass in the mosaic form around the skirt. So that's the relationship here. And here you see more of it. And I started doing mosaic. I think the first major mosaic work was for Princeton University. That was, I think, 2015.
It's interesting, the skirt and art, because I think of this really great Piero della Francesca, which is the Madonna del Parto, and she's got this skirt, and then the villagers are at the very bottom, almost like peeking out from underneath the umbrella of this skirt. And the skirt is a very interesting thing. It maybe is like underutilized as an element. So it's really good to see this in a sculpture.
Also, she is sort of breaking out of that ceiling. So it was the glass ceiling. And then if you look at the photograph here at the top, there is actually it's broken already. It's got it's for ventilation. So all of this was feeding into the relationship that I was drawing between both. And then also, I've used this sort of circular form, like here, all these sort of multiple skirts come together, but it could be a flower, it could be an opium flower, maybe it has risen to the surface, maybe it's untethered to any particular time. It's, again, those two female characters that are in the drawing behind you. So,
right.
There's always been this sort of duality that appears on and off, even in the sculpture on the right. Some detail. And then the sculpture which is on the roof is the whole thing is sort of emerging out of the seat of the lotus. And I think the invisible roots of the lotus that you don't see, that lie below the depth of the water, they are very much echoed in the roots of the feminine form. So that was something that I really wanted to bring in. And I wanted to bring her onto the roof with her own plinth. of sorts, right? Like I didn't want to borrow anything that was there. And
Were you surprised by the backlash from the conservative right in the
a
media
little bit.
against the sculpture?
I know, because it went on in some other crazy direction. Like, it's not really about the work. Like, I don't know, like there were things that I didn't read all of it, but many people were reaching out and they were like, the conversation was like baby eating devil. You know, it just like, it goes on and on. It's like, it's its own history. It's creating its own visual history also. But here you saw, here's the piece sort of rising on the crane. It was so beautiful to see this. It was very, you know, majestic, and it just sort of was, it just rose to the onto the roof.
It must have been such a powerful moment for you to see the crane like hoisting.
Yeah, absolutely. And then when I thought of this, then I was like, oh, here I was trying to make this form sort of rise, right? So here it's my drawing projected into night, and the light falls on the landscape, on the trees, a little bit on the wall, and even in the details, it looks so much like the mosaics.
It
So
does.
it does, right? And so sort of like she's fluttering and trying to sort of lift herself up, and that's just, again, like so much similarity.
I would think it would feel exultant for a lot of women, especially with, you know, as a symbol for the judicial system, and maybe for people of all minorities, just that it's so unlike the other statues that are up there.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, that particular spot had been empty for 75 years.
Wow.
So I'm like, okay, I proposed it as part of the Madison Square Park project, that what if we put something there? So it's not that the courthouse commissioned it.
That's like a really brilliant idea. For those who don't live in New York, can you tell us how many blocks away it is, the two sculptures?
Oh, they are literally on 25th Street, and the courthouse is on the corner overlooking the park on Madison Avenue and 25th. And then the other entrance, one of the many entrances, but the one where the largest sculpture is, that's on 5th Avenue and 25th. So you can actually, is pretty much, you can see the building from the other location, but you can sometimes you can, if you know, you can pretty much see the sculpture also from afar. But so much of that detail, of course, you can't, because you can't go up to the roof. But it's quite interesting how much you can really see. So this is in bronze, and it's hand painted, it's in patina. It's kind of like, I was also thinking of, you know, how classical statuary was often colored. Like there's a great show at the Met right now, Chroma, on some of the older sculptures, how they may have been in their original form, and they're all sort of like in different bright colors. We're so not used to it. So here also, it was interesting how some people that were reacting and responding were reminiscing that, oh, something is being removed, like these white, colorless sculptures that they, in their imagination, are devoid of color, but are rooted in a very Western understanding of sculpture, that somehow that culture is being removed. And nothing has been removed, no sculpture has been replaced, nothing has, you know, has been taken down. So it's also the rhetoric and the language that started to sort of go on in some crazy direction it has nothing to do with the work.
It is interesting, though, at the Met show, which is a great show for those who can catch it. We view those sculptures with those vivid colors as being garish, and we like kind of the time-beaten sun, wind, sea, everything that's turn them into these monochrome, aged white pieces. It's so interesting to try to adjust our vision back to that, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree. It is. It's but I play with a lot of colors, so for me, it's been really exciting to even like see the show. I just saw it the other day, but when I was working on my first sculpture, that was in 2019. This is what I was reading many people, including the historian Sarah Bond, on how classical meant, not all of it, but whatever, like the idea that the classical statuary was not lily white as in popular imagination, and how, again, it's the same thing that you're saying right earlier, like you keep saying the same thing and then that becomes the truth.
Right.
I think that aspect of art history is something that interests me deeply, that it's like that obviously human civilizations have been in conversation with each other for a long time. So this idea of like East-West and West Islam, or oppressive free Asian white, like these sort of binaries are so ridiculous, but they exist because you often get placed in those binaries.
Right. And I think that's one of the big problems with our world today, is that everybody's getting their ideas from their own sources and they're not cross-referencing to other sources. So we're becoming more extreme, which is really a big problem. So in a way, art like yours, I think it creates a dialogue and it initiates conversation, which I think is really productive. Museum of Fine Arts. So your show traveled to the Museum of Fine Arts.
It did. And this work it's in their collection, but here also you can see, look at this character and then the painting on the right. That's like that there's so much connection right there. That one also is looking at where it sort of is, she's putting her foot down on the sort of shadow, like white sort of shadowy ghost-like character. So again, I think I was thinking about how what is, who gets to be an American, who doesn't, what are the different types of nationalisms. I think this is a time when I was traveling between living in both Houston and New York. So often these idea of like what constitutes an assimilated immigrant in the US, like those conversations were happening. And then that character, the painting on the right, is also sort of building of an apparatus of power, where there are multiple iterations of the feminine, and that kind of how to make a drawing mythic. And that really is amazing how that idea echoed in the sculpture exists, takes a different type of real estate, right? And then that becomes almost like, though it's temporary, but like even like there was a New York Times opinion piece on the lurking fear, right? That is always there. Like what was it? It was like, be careful of what you let in. So that for me has always been really present in the idea of women, femininity, or women in power. It's like the threat that exists whenever, femininity becomes a marker. And it's also a marker when boundaries are starting to melt. It's that deep-rooted fear that somehow surfaces.
In a way, though, your work has always been about initiating a cultural conversation. Could you tell our audience a little bit about how you initiated your trip to Washington, D.C.?
Oh, way back in the 90s?
Yeah, but I mean, that's really an early dialogue, but it is a cultural language about communication between people of different countries. Am I right?
Well, the way I came to the US was I got a lot of recognition as a very young artist in Pakistan when I graduated, on that scroll painting that I showed earlier. and I was invited to teach alongside the master painter Bashir Ahmed, and I started teaching in 1992. And at that time, I was very young, and I was teaching people my age, and but it allowed like also younger kids around that it was okay to engage in this craft-based medium, and that there was room for experimentation. And so suddenly, there were more people that signed up. So I knew that I was instrumental in bringing in a younger generation that readily started to see what the potential in manuscript painting was. And in that time, I also was, I got like my first introduction into the politics of academia. I was like, oh my God, I do not like it. It was like, academic politics are severe all across the world. So I as a young artist, I was like, it was traumatic. And I was also thinking that I really want to make art and grow and develop. So I was looking for opportunities to do a master's. And there was none in those years. There were no scholarships that one could look into or available that I knew of in Pakistan. So how it happened was like I reached out to the Pakistani ambassador to the US, and the woman there, and then eventually met her and wrote to her, and then met her, and also was like, oh, you should do exhibitions of young Pakistani artists. It'll be great for the image as well for the country. So it was, and then eventually, it was like, okay, if you want to show your work, then get your show together, put your show together. Like it was on me how much of involvement I wanted, or how much I could put it all together. So I put all of these, the drawings were small, so put them all together, started to work on it. And then literally 5 days before I heard that I could travel standby on Pakistani Airlines. And I was so excited, and I came with 2 suitcases. In those years, you put your art in the suitcase, imagine. It was just like art in the suitcase, and 2 suitcases come. And I had a show as part of the Pakistani National Day in March. And it was only for an evening. And that was it. It was for the evening with the Pakistani community there, and I was putting up the work with Velcro in the back, attaching it everywhere, and pricing it everything under $50 or $20, and nobody bought anything. It was amazing. I was like so emotional, the whole thing. And then I ended up reaching a lot of art schools on the East Coast. In those years, on a Pakistani passport, you could travel, right? Like you could travel in the US. Post 9/11, you couldn't even get a visa to come anywhere. So you had the See America ticket for tourists, which was like a Euro-rail. So for like 3 months, you could travel standby. And that was, my father had gifted that to me. So I had that, and I called up different art schools. I met many people. I carried all the work that hadn't sold, put it in a portfolio. The large scroll painting, I put it in that blank garbage bag. I'd never seen a large garbage bag, and I didn't have the means. So I was like, put that in there, showed up at RISD also in the same way, and met with Dennis Congdon. So what I really appreciated about RISD was that when I met Dennis, it was really like I met him, and he introduced me to his students and took me out for lunch. It was like, I was like, RISD was just so amazing, like how it was not a big deal to be able to reach out to people. And then the whole thing was how to find financial aid for school, which is also a beautiful, wonderful story, how all of that materialized. But yeah. So then I moved to Houston. So doing the show in Houston was wonderful because I was there for the core program as an artist in residence in 95 and spent a lot of early years, formative years were spent kind of running around in Houston and developing a body of work there. Oh yeah, so in the park, we also did this lens called the apparition lens with Snapchat. And it allows the viewer to see the sculpture on the roof in actual, like in it at all different, from all different sides. You can walk up to it, you can look at it, you can look behind it. So it sort of comes up and then disappears. And that is something I really wanted to do, because I was aware that the sculpture would be hard to access the way it sits on the roof. So moving here, so some of the sketches. So, oh yeah, like the collar on the figure, both the figures is a nod to Ruth Ginsburg. It's the way she feminized the Black male robes. And so it's not like the sculpture is not her, the sculpture is not about her, but there was like a borrowing of her.
Well, I think for many of the conservatives, it became about her.
Yeah.
They, that is kind of the, the torch that they would carry.
Yeah. So that's here. Then here, there was I was going to draw. Yeah, there's, again, I've played with hair in so many different ways. And there are many sources that, one is always aware of and looking at again. And it does not cite it's not about the Medusa at all, but that's also something that gets projected right away. It's looking at many other traditions. And then there's this one painting here. You can see that actually it's like lifted right from that particular work, Pleasure Pillars, which when I did this painting, I had a show at Asia Society that got postponed. It was happening in September of 2001, and I had the work still with me, or maybe the work was returned and the show happened later, but I added many layers here. So this was after the attacks of 9/11. But when I kind of evolved the work later, I also wanted to respond to this very paternalistic justification for the war in Afghanistan as saving, Muslim women. And my work was really pointing to feminine, sensual depictions of feminine power. So it was like counter to that rhetoric. And here is another piece where these bodies that are all sort of feminine, they kind of take over the depiction of the court paintings, which often have a sense of like it's a male-dominated space, but it's also very much about sovereignty. It's about patriarchy, and they sort of disrupt that space. And as they leave the trace behind, and the trace is just their head. So when I was experimenting in this way, I was like, oh, wouldn't it be great if I can make this narrative clearer if I animated it? So the drawing started to sort of, as I was drawing and erasing and adding elements, I was capturing every moment, and that sort of led into animation. And then when you look at these elements, how they're singular elements coming together like that, isn't that so close to the idea of mosaic as well? So there are these layers of paper, but that are transparent in nature. They accumulate and they give the illusion of movement and transparencies, but then even the elements painted on the paper also are very sort of kind of like a particle system. And that, when I started to sort of create animations, and eventually it was the animation that led to mosaic. I was equating the idea of the pixel to the unit of the mosaic. Even the wall drawings that I have been making over time, like the ideas are really how an element can accumulate, and in its accumulation, the DNA remains the same, but the illusion is very different. So even when the hair descends in Times Square at midnight, it's choreographed in so many different ways, and at times it looks very fluid. So it can operate as something solid, but also liquid. So the first project.
I think so much about your work existing in silence, but to have seen it in Times Square with the honking and with the people bustling and kind of bumping into you as you're looking, it must have been a very interesting experience for you to see your own art that way, and also in such a populist way that everybody's invited to see it. It must have been pretty cool, right?
Super cool, of course.
Yeah.
It was, I had a studio at the Elizabeth Foundation for the Arts, so I think I wasn't that aware of the Times Arts organization, and then once I found out about it, then I reached out, I submitted, I was like, okay, I have a studio right here, there's got to be a way. I used to walk at night, so I was like, I never would have thought otherwise. And then I found out like all these incredible projects that they have done with artists. So the Midnight Moment was absolutely wonderful to experience. And even looking like that opportunity to see your work in that scale, that itself gives you, then allows you to sort of expand your work in a different manner. So seeing it at that scale allowed me to push the boundary of the animated works that I was making. Single channel works became multi-channel works, but single image with multi-channel. So like the idea of the single composition, but with multiple channels started to happen. And that's sort of what's happened with the Mosaic also, that I wasn't that keen on Mosaic. I don't know, it never came to me, but I had to come up with the solution to create work with longevity. So glass was a natural element. And then I was thinking, what else could I do so I didn't want to just make a drawing and then have the drawing fabricated into a mosaic. So I thought, oh, what if I animate my drawing and capture the animated drawing and then start the mosaic based on the drawing in motion. And that would perhaps carry a different sort of energy from inside. I don't know. So this is the wonderful residency I had with the Franz Meer studio in Munich, and able to spend some time there in those years that allowed me to really understand the language of mosaic very closely. So this is the piece which is up at Princeton University, and it was really amazing to work on this piece with them. And it's about almost 70 feet. And yes, there she is again. She is also on one of the second floors. The whole narrative runs from bottom to the roof, so from the floor to the ceiling. So you can walk around it, you can touch it, and then you can also see it from afar with 40-foot ceilings, like here. But the drawings were really like to scale. So that was also learning how all of it gets assembled. Like here you can see how some of the elements that I wanted, like this hair that I was talking about, that's etched in, because it's impossible to cut that in the stone. So I kind of played with, it's got marble, it's got glass, but it also has ceramic. It also has etched ceramic in it. And there it is again in that sort of idea is in the animation parallax.
Do you see time and death as a big element in your work?
Yeah, this particular work deals with that also. It deals with the annals of time, with history, and with literary tropes about that. But that parallax was very much created with that in mind. You know, it was on the colonial history in the Strait of Hormuz. So there are some drawings related to that, but so that whole piece is it's like a multi-channel piece, but again created over a year with lots of visits to Sharjah, working with the composer, with poets, with animation. Like, it was a long collaborative piece that looked at the region's history, colonial history. But then some element of that was the drawings that led to the animation are some of the drawings that found their way into the mosaic. So like the drawing on the right is literally just 8 inches. And then the mosaic is 14 feet. So even when I make the animated works, I can scan the drawings at super high resolution. And then you can keep going inside and inside the drawings until they almost look like cartographic landscapes or satellite imagery. And I love that idea that comes about with the gouache, how it sits in the pores of the paper. And then it almost looks, you know, you can't even see the final image with the naked eye, because when you take take 2 inches and it becomes 10 feet, a little ink dot can look like a toiling figure. I kind of was also interested in this micro macro relationship between with this idea in the mosaic as well, that it can be reduced to a dot, and then it can also sort of expand in this manner.
Is there another artist that you think of where you've experienced this, historical or contemporary, any artist who inspires you, who you keep referring back to?
Sorry?
Is there an artist who, like, it could be historical or it could be contemporary, whose work you think about quite a bit in your own life or even in your work?
Well, I love, you know, I know that I've said it many times, but I also love a lot of poets, and I love feminist poets a lot. So it's like from Pakistani to American, but Famida Riaz, Ismat Chagtai, there's Adrian Rich, Wislava Szymborska, there's young people like Solmaz Sharif. So I don't know, like, I don't know how, like when I make a painting, for example, like this painting, like I put it here because of the element that I was borrowing, which is heart as Africa. And this painting actually cites Langston Hughes and Nasser Jones. And it goes on in a different tangent, but even in making this work, I was thinking, like, you know, I always think like how a poet writes their poem. So the closest I can think of is like how I create my composition is like a poet. That's how I think. Each painting is like a poem. They are connected, but they are very unique. And then how can I crystallize a moment in time that you can come back to it 10 years later, 20 years later, and what is it that makes that work timeless? And maybe those are the struggles that I think the most in terms of like a kind of this parallel with poetry. I don't know if that makes sense.
Makes total sense. Absolutely.
Oh, this is so cool. This is how it was all assembled. So like all the pieces were cut up into literally like a foot by foot, very small, and then they were assembled like a puzzle. And you can never see, you know, where they connect. Just sort of like, I love like the working hands-on and learning, you know, if like here, because this was for a particular project, it's permanent, it's for Princeton University, I had to come up with a material like paintings on paper wouldn't, we're not going to fly there. So that's one of the reasons why I had to work with glass. But then in the process of wanting to engage that material, I spent time in Munich, and then in those 10 months, 8 to 10 months, became familiar with the language of mosaic, so developed a closer relationship to it.
It's funny because the staircase resembles the staircase that was in a work that you showed us at the beginning of the presentation with,
I didn't think of it.
Such an interesting idea about people walking through this, much as you had those two figures walking through that staircase. It's really fascinating.
So then there is another piece on the other entrance, which is at Princeton also, but it's glass, but it's painted on glass. So there, mosaic was glass and marble, but still, a lot of it is glass tile. And so thinking of continuing to think with that material, so it may not technically look like mosaic, but literally it's like just thinking about light and drama of glass and being able to tell the story with that material. So this is a piece that came about like that. But this one is very close to my drawings. Like, it was really interesting to see how much of the ink drawing can translate so beautifully on that material. So these are the drawings. But even if you look at these drawings, you can break them down into these smaller areas that, since we're talking about mosaic, they start looking like mosaics to me. But this particular work is also looking at empire, the history of sort of empire and what it means in terms of, the kind of monetization of language and labor and human intelligence. So a lot of my animated works play on those themes. This one is called The Last Post. Then there's also Disruption as Rapture. There is Reckoning, which is playing also in the Madison Square Park. Like, look at this. This is just a still from one of the animated works. And of course, this will translate very easily into mosaic. But so does writing. So like this particular work is English and Urdu combined. And if you, when I was doing this work, I was really thinking how language and geography play a role in contested histories, and how this sort of X marks this spot, right? Which is always in motion. You don't know what is the target, and this sort of movement that is encapsulated. But if you look at the detail, it doesn't look like the way the mosaic experience is, like it's broken down to a gesture, a mark, a little fragment coming together and building itself.
To me, mosaics are very special. As you know, Shahzia, I divide my time between Rome and Connecticut. When you're walking in the churches, the mosaics on the floor are materials that were reused. They were, they deemed whatever it was that they were fracturing to create a mosaic as being impertinent or unrelated to what the world needed. So it seems as though it's like this thing about fracturing history and recontextualizing it seems to be a part of mosaic.
Yeah, it does, right? And then like over here, I'm using text to play with that idea. But like this Urdu text on the right, that's upside down, also intentionally to sort of give the illusion of water and writing together. But then when I saw this image on the top right, that's the image of the clutter in space, the human clutter in space. And it was so uncanny. It's like, it looks almost so close to the drawing I made. So, it's this also the feminine in nature and against the environmental catastrophe. So I just placed that picture there because I just found that it was so uncanny.
Is that the last picture in your presentation?
But I can end the presentation.
Oh, was
Right
that,
here.
you have this
No,
Epson?
no. Like, my presentations can go on and on. We don't have to do that.
I don't think we're going to get to our presentation, but for those out there who would like, they could see our exhibition Mosaics at jamesbarronart.com. You know, we have a really beautiful kind of mosaic of mosaics. The idea is how contemporary artists take the concept or the idea of mosaics, even if it's not literal, and make a mosaic. And I think that's very much what we've seen with your work, Shahzia. If there are any questions out there, we could, Maria, did we have any questions? Looks like I also would like to take this opportunity to thank Dylan Everett, Hasey Cross, and Maria Clamus for their work on this presentation, my team. And also, Dylan, unfortunately, we're not going to get to your presentation. We'll break it up and use it in a mosaic and something else. Here's one question. I'm going to, let's see. It's for Shahzia. Do you improve your idea and you make it, or you may have made changes as you work? I'm not sure if I quite understood. Let me, do you understand the question?
I guess I think it's the process is really key to me. Like I evolve. The work evolves. It's always changing. So I work with very intuitively.
Yeah.
I may have a clarity, but I may not know how to get there. And that process is intuitive.
Right. Let's see. So to kind of end, I thought I would start with the beginning, which is a really funny mosaic in time. Shahzia, I don't know if you're going to remember this, but I had rented an apartment and I was headed to the Armory show or the ADAA show. And I was in a lobby and I saw you walking across the lobby holding a portfolio. And I asked where this subway was because I'm totally unfamiliar with being like at the tip of Manhattan. And you said, oh my God, where are you going? I said, well, like 68th and Park. You said, oh my God, well, what's up there? And I said, an art fair. He said, I've got to work in there. And then I recognized you. So in a funny way, I suppose this is ending with the beginning, which is how odd it is, how much serendipity there is in the world, and how, I think you really hit it on the head, how poetic your work is. It can't really be encapsulated and described. And I think that's partly what we saw, you know, people looking for handles on your work, whether it's the conservative right or maybe other people. I think what makes it so powerful is how mysterious it is and how it continues to evolve. So are there any thoughts you would like to add before we close?
Oh, thank you, James, for such a generous conversation. I absolutely loved it. It's nice to have a conversation through the process of sharing the work, and I hope we will continue this.
There's one more question, but hi, Shahzia, can you speak about the connection between the woman's roots and the boundary created by the skirt in Witness?
The root and?
The boundary.
Can you repeat?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Can you speak about the connection between the woman's roots and the boundary created by the skirt in Witness?
So the roots of the feminine form are kind of, it's like a word being used around, but for me, it's like she's self-rooted. So it's sort of like a very fluid representation of the feminine figure. It's not like a very figurative, it's a little bit abstracted, like very much like the self. It's very amorphous, it's female, it's fluid. And it's like the ink, that kind of ink lines go right back into the body. And then the roots are, it looks like roots, but it wasn't technically that I was making roots for the female character, but I have said that it feels like she's self-rooted, so she can she is adaptable. She can be across different periods of time. She is timeless, or she can float around. She's buoyant. She can, so that's what I wanted to express, and that's what's happening. She's breaking out of the skirt. So the skirt may be hoisting the form so that it doesn't touch the ground, but the idea and the general feeling of the sculpture is that despite its scale of almost 20 feet, it feels very light, and it's kind of moving upward as if she's afloat and she's moving up. And that's where I thought that the skirt could be the proverbial glass ceiling that she's breaking out of.
Isn't it nice to think that maybe your work and even your career as an artist could inspire girls who maybe are afraid to express themselves in a really poetic, mysterious, and uncontainable way into making art. Shahzia, what I really came away with that show at the Morgan was, I felt the journey of you as a human being, as somebody coming to this country as an artist, and it was really powerful. It felt kind of the forward motion. I know there was a lot of meandering as you got there, but I think that's what made it so special. So I would just like to end by saying thank you for your work, and for your show, and for being with us today.
Thank you so much, James. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.